the floor that was finished. It was the roll coat scenario. It's the floor that I did the different tests of prep tools and so forth on. And I showed the video that I did to just a couple of guys to gauge, you know, their thoughts and so forth, to see what sort of questions I might have. And it came back with a bunch of questions. So I thought I'd actually shoot another quick video just answering those questions. So if I step through them sort of piecemeal. First one was, they noticed in the videos that I was wearing double gloves, and these are disposable nitrile gloves, and I wear cotton gloves underneath. And the reason why is because there's a couple of reasons. One is it's easy for me to change nitrile gloves, to change those disposable gloves when you've got cotton gloves on, because the sweat is contained within the glove. If you don't have that cotton glove on, it's a nightmare trying to put gloves back on when you've got wet hands. Secondly, the sweat is held in the cotton gloves, so you don't end up with sweat building up inside your glove and then falling out down your arm when you raise your arm, or when you take your gloves off, you've got this massive amount of sweat everywhere. So that's the main two reasons. The third reason is it's actually quite comfortable to hold a tool like that, because when you're wearing just cotton, just latex gloves, or nitrile gloves, it's not actually particularly comfortable to hold a tool. But with the cottons underneath, it's nice to hold trowels and roller poles and things like that. So that's the question around why do I wear cotton gloves. The second question was to do with, they saw in the second part of the video, which was the top coat, that I was wearing these things, pullovers, and these are called clean boot, and they actually came from the plumbing trade and so forth, where people were walking with muddy feet outside and then coming into the home, so they would slip these things on. I wanted to try this on this particular floor, and you can see that I actually did step in the resin, which was a good test, because even though I wanted to keep it clean, it showed me that it didn't end up too slippery as a result, which would be a bit of a nightmare if you have slippery shoes, or like those disposable hospital slip-on plastic covers. So that's the clean boot. You can find them online, I'm sure, clean boot. If not, let me know. The other questions that came into play was more to do with functionality. So, as an example, they noticed that I didn't use a primer on the floor. I went straight on there with a roll coat, and they're used to priming everything every time. And I tried to explain that it comes down to what the roll coat is. It's not just any old roll coat that you can put down. You've got to be considerate about how it's been put together. So as an example, some roll coats, you'll see that their density, SG, is around 1.6. Now that sounds a little bit technical, right? But what that means is they've got a lot of heavy fillers in that amount of resin to try to bulk it out, and it can be because they're trying to make it cheaper or better opacity. Some of those fillers are pigment extenders, and so forth. Now if it is so heavily filled, then the consequence of that is it can dry it out, and at that point you start talking about needing primers, because the actual resin component is what you want to bond and seep into the concrete. Now the product I use is called Epoxy Rollcoat. Its density isn't particularly high. It's got a certain body to it, but it's not because of the fillers that they've added, or because of fumed silica like Cabasil and that sort of thing that people can also add to give it body. So I'm quite used to that product, and that's what I used, and I'm happy to put it on direct to concrete. The other comment made was they noticed in the video that I used a block squeegee on the first coat and yet a notched squeegee on the second coat. So it was for a couple of reasons. I wanted to play with both squeegees. But I've also read the reviews on the notched squeegee, and it highlights that the notches wear out pretty quickly when you're bulldozing, when you're pushing the squeegee on concrete, on bare concrete. And that makes sense because the profile of concrete is quite aggressive, so it's going to rub that TPR rubber out. That's the bottom of the squeegee. So I wanted to use the block squeegee. That way I know that I wasn't going to scrub the squeegee out too bad. And I tend to pull it. I just learned to pull the squeegee rather than push it. And that's partly because then I don't step in the resin, but yeah, that's just how I was taught, and been doing that for 20 years now, so it's a bit hard to change. So that was a good pickup. The other point that was asked is, on the first coat I was on spike shoes, but on the second coat I was wearing the slip-on boots. And why was that? And again, there was a couple of reasons. I'm doing these videos to question, to learn, to understand more, to problem solve. That's what I like to do. So it's certainly easier working with solventless epoxies on spike shoes. It's more relaxing. You've got more time to put it out. You can take your time cutting in, making a smaller mix and so forth, and you can work it. You can walk back on it and fix it. If something lands in it, you can fix it and so forth. However, the spike shoes can also leave marks the next day if the product hasn't cured enough. So when I came along the next day, I tested it in a sort of inconspicuous area, and I could see that there was a risk that I was going to damage the coating. And yes, I could have waited longer before I started walking on there, but I chose to go on it. And in fact, it was 125 square meters. A lot of guys comment that that's too big for one person to do without spike shoes. I showed it's not a problem with spike shoes, but without spike shoes, it can be a lot more work. And so I wanted to sort of test that out and prove it for myself. The result was, it's certainly doable. I showed that. I did step in the resin, bit of a problem, but not really a deal breaker. It did put me under more pressure, particularly in that last area. I did a couple of errors where my cutting in touched on the skirting board, so I wasn't as calm. I felt more under pressure, and that's when errors can happen, and you have to be mindful of that. Okay, and then the last area was actually an analysis of the different profiles. So I'm a fan of how shot blasting prepares the substrate. It leaves it clean, it leaves a profile and so forth. But I have shot a video before where I start to question how we're interpreting the CSPs, the concrete surface profiles put out by ICRI. And not because I think they're wrong, but because perhaps we're using them the wrong way. So as an example, shot blasting produced this beautiful profile, but that's assuming that the concrete is the same everywhere. And the reality is, the concrete is not the same everywhere. There are some areas that have far more latence on the surface. There are some areas that are a bit watered down compared to others. So you set up the shot blaster to run at a particular configuration, speed, blast, and so forth, and it's doing a wonderful job through 90% of it, and then it hits some bad patches before you realize that you've blown it out. And that's what happened. And I don't know if you can see that really in this area. What I'll do, I'll shoot another video that's showing you the detail. But what that told me was, if I'm doing a roll coat system and the specification is calling for shot blasting, then I need to be allowing for a scratch coat afterwards, because there's bound to be areas where it's going to blow out, and I'm going to have to fix that. Otherwise, it'll show in the roll coat. So they were the questions that arose from the warehouse coating that I did, and hopefully they all make sense. If you have any other questions on it, of course, then please ask. As always, I'm ResinJack. Take care and keep smiling.